You're listening to
Killer Communications,
brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons,
DNA ID,
Campus Killings,
Scene of the Crime,
Zodiac Speaking,
and
Beyond Bizarre True Crime.
All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
Between 2007 and 2010, 4 female sex workers were reported missing out of the New York City area. Of those 4, 2 of their families and friends received unsettling phone calls from a man with a monotone voice who knew everything about their missing loved ones. But who the man was wouldn't be revealed for over a decade. Chapter 1. The Phone Calls. In July 2007, sex worker Sarah Carnes was sitting in her Manhattan hotel room after a job when she received a phone call from a blocked number. She picked up, expecting a client, but instead the man asked her if she knew a woman named Maureen Brainerd Barnes. Sarah sat up. Maureen was her best friend who'd gone missing only days prior, and no one had seen or heard from her since she'd gone out to meet a client. Before Sarah could answer, the man went on to describe Maureen, right down to the tattoo she had on her arm. Yes, Sarah answered. That was her best friend he was describing, and she had 2 little children who wanted to know what had happened to their mother. Did the man know where she was? He replied, "Oh, she's not missing. I just saw her. She's at a whorehouse in Queens." Sarah found the term whorehouse to be odd, but she needed to find her friend. She asked the man if he could call her back on an unrestricted number so she could get a hold of him again to find Maureen. The man said sure, but hung up and never called her again. Sarah went to the police, but the call could only be traced back to a burner phone, and Sarah quickly lost hope of ever seeing her best friend again. Almost 2 years later, in the summer of 2009, 15-year-old Amanda Bartholomew's sister Melissa had gone missing after leaving a New York City apartment. While her family had immediately put in a missing persons report on Melissa and called every local hospital, jail, and women's shelter in the city, no one had heard anything from Melissa in several weeks. That was until July 17th, when Amanda's cell phone rang and Melissa's name came up in their caller ID. Amanda answered immediately, but it wasn't her sister's voice on the other end of the line. It was a man's. He said, "Is this Melissa's little sister?" She replied that she was, to which the caller said, "Do you know what your sister is doing? She's a whore." Amanda was shocked to hear this, as Melissa had left her home in Buffalo, New York, to be a hairstylist in New York City. But before Amanda could ask any more questions, the man hung up. Over the next weeks, Melissa's phone called Amanda over 9 times, but it was never Melissa. It was always the man, talking in a low, monotone voice, taunting Amanda about her sister and calling Melissa a whore and a slut. He spewed taunts and allegations, telling Amanda the sexually explicit things he'd done to Melissa, and sending unsettling text messages that included things like, "I'm watching your sister rot." Amanda told her parents about the calls from this unknown man, but anytime they tried to talk to him, he'd hang up and not call back for several days. It seemed he would only talk to Amanda, and his most chilling conversation with her included admitting that he killed Melissa. Desperate to find out if these allegations were true, the Bartholomew family did a TV interview where they talked about the unsettling calls, but this level of awareness seemed to scare off the caller. Amanda received no more calls from her sister's phone after August of 2009. But the call that would set off a series of unprecedented investigations and finally reveal the man behind the phone line was placed to 911 in the spring of 2010. Chapter 2. A Job Gone Wrong. At around 4:30 a.m. on May 1st, 2010, a 23-year-old escort named Shannon Gilbert called 911 as she ran from a client's Oak Beach, Long Island home. She was screaming, "There's somebody after me." While the operator tried to get location information, Shannon only replied that she didn't know where she was, but someone was going to kill her. Over the next 21 minutes, Shannon swayed between calmly telling the operator she needed help to screaming as a man's voice could be heard over the call. The man was Shannon's driver, who was allegedly trying to calm her down and take her back to her apartment in New Jersey, but she escaped her driver and ran into the marshes that led out into the ocean, the 911 call stopping abruptly. It was the last time anyone would hear from Shannon Gilbert. Chapter 3. A Missing Persons Report and a Long Wait. While her family filed a missing persons report on Shannon only 48 hours after she vanished, police had little to go on, since Shannon hadn't been able to tell the 911 operator her location during her call. Her family also cites that because Shannon was a sex worker, they didn't feel law enforcement made her disappearance a priority, and when it became clear to them that police could not provide the type of support they wanted to find Shannon, her mother, sister, and boyfriend went to Oak Beach themselves to start searching for her. But the marshes around the gated community were filled with water, and the brambles dividing the roads from the marsh were vast and almost impenetrable. There were no signs of Shannon. For over 7 months, there was no movement in her case, despite several police searches for her, and her family despaired of ever knowing what happened to her that fateful night. But on December 11, 2010, Officer John Malia took his cadaver dog, Blue, back out to Oak Beach for one final try. Though the other searches had been through the marshes themselves, since that was where Shannon was thought to have disappeared, Officer Malia took a new tactic on this trip. Using information he'd learned from the FBI that bodies were often dumped closer along road lines, he took Blue along the shoulder of the Ocean Parkway, and much to his surprise, Blue alerted to a body in a thicket of brambles. The remains were badly decomposed and wrapped in disintegrating burlap. Had the officer and his dog finally found Shannon Gilbert? Chapter 3. A Killing Ground. What law enforcement would discover as they swarmed the scene and combed the area for more evidence wasn't just one body, but 4. Each one was wrapped in decaying burlap and lay about 500 feet from each other. And their autopsies revealed an even more unsettling discovery. They were all petite, white females in their early 20s who'd been killed via strangulation, and once they were identified, it was found that all 4 had been working as self-employed online escorts. In quick succession, they were identified as Melissa Bartholomew, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. Much to the officer's surprise, none of these women were Shannon Gilbert, and it was still unclear what had happened to her. But what was clear was Long Island was apparently home to a serial killer who preyed on sex workers. Now all they had to do was find him, which meant looking into the lives of 4 victims for clues, but it wouldn't be an easy task. Chapter 4. Who were the Gilgo 4? Quickly dubbed the Gilgo 4 by the media since they'd all been found right off the road near Long Island's Gilgo Beach, police began digging into their backgrounds for patterns and similarities that might lead to their killer. The first to disappear was Maureen Brainerd Barnes, who'd last been seen by her friend Sarah in July 2007. The two were friends who did online sex work together, in which they'd post ads on Craigslist and communicate with clients via text and phone before making a deal. In later interviews, Sarah explained that they often worked together for safety, making sure to only take clients at specific hotels, and never going out to meet a client on their own. And in fact, Maureen had left the escort industry in 2006 after taking a seasonal telemarketing job. But that July 2007, Maureen had become desperate for money. She had 2 small children, was furloughed from her job, and she received a notice that she'd be evicted from her home if she couldn't come up with the mortgage by the end of the month. She needed money quickly, and she knew that sex work would fill the gap until she could find other work. So on July 6th, Maureen left her children in the care of her sister and boarded a train from Connecticut to New York City to spend the weekend setting up clients from a Manhattan hotel room. During this time, Maureen took a call from a client who requested she come to meet him at a different location. While Sarah explained Maureen would normally not have agreed to it, her desperation was palpable. And after 16 phone exchanges between Maureen and her client over the course of 3 days, she finally agreed to meet him where he wanted. After that, she was never heard from again. The only trace was the strange blocked phone call Sarah received a few days after Maureen's disappearance. Second to go missing was Melissa Bartholomew, who left Buffalo, New York with her beautician's license to become a hairstylist in New York City. But life in New York City was too expensive to live on just being a hairstylist, and Melissa had turned to online escorting to support herself, which meant that when her family filed their initial missing persons report, the NYPD did not see it as a priority. Melissa was an adult living her life in the city as a sex worker. The police thought perhaps she just didn't want to contact her family at the time. And in the end, no one looked for her. That is until her 15-year-old sister Amanda started receiving those phone calls from Melissa's phone. This gave police something to go on, and when the Bartholomews reported the calls, police were able to triangulate them to several Manhattan areas, including the Port Authority, Times Square, and the Empire State Building. But the calls were never long enough for police to find out the man's identity, and the areas he called from were so busy, it was impossible to pinpoint exactly where he was. All they had was the sound of his voice and the fact that he was calculating and seemed to enjoy scaring Melissa's family. But once the family went public about the calls, Melissa's phone never dialed Amanda's again. The third missing woman was 22-year-old Megan Waterman, who'd last been seen on June 5, 2010. Megan had visited her boyfriend, who was also allegedly her pimp, on the 5th, telling him that she'd be going out on a job, and she would call him when she was done. But he never heard from her again. The mother of a 3-year-old daughter, Megan had left her hometown in Maine to go to New York City to get a job as an actress. But when she started dating her boyfriend, he allegedly got her into sex work, and she began placing ads on Craigslist to meet clients. She was last seen on June 6, 2010, on surveillance footage from a hotel in Hopogway, New York, about 15 miles from Gilgo Beach. Her cell phone was left in her room at the hotel, something her family said was very odd behavior for her. The last of the Gilgo Four was Amber Costello. The oldest of the four, Amber was 27 years old and had gotten into sex work to support her heroin addiction. At the time of her disappearance, Amber was running a scam with her roommate, David Schaller, in which Amber would have clients come to the apartment and collect money up front. But before any services were rendered, Dave would run in acting like an angry boyfriend and scare off the client. The two would split the money. According to Dave, they pulled their last scam on a man that he described as hulking, around 6'6" and broad-shouldered. Unlike most clients who would run away in fear, this man was angry and stomped out of the apartment where he got in a green Chevy Avalanche and sped away. The next day, Amber began receiving multiple calls from this client, saying what she'd done wasn't nice. But he was willing to pay her $1,500, which was 6 times her usual rate, if she left her cell phone and purse at home and got in his car to take a drive with him. Dave later told the media that Amber would never have done this. She was an experienced escort and was always very safe. It was one of the reasons they used the boyfriend scam. But this client was persuasive, keeping Amber on the phone for almost an hour with each call. And eventually, after 8 or 9 phone conversations, the money was too much to turn down. The last time Dave saw Amber, she was walking down their West Babylon, New York street. She disappeared around the corner, and he never saw her again. Chapter 5. The investigation stalls under complications. Despite extensive research, investigators still had little to go on. They knew their perpetrator trolled Craigslist for potential victims, like the specific kind of young woman, all small, under 120 pounds, in their early to mid-20s, and that he was somehow able to get them to agree to meet him in undisclosed locations. But police had also found important clues in the form of several hairs that were between 2 of the women's bodies and the burlap. These hairs were taken to the lab for testing. At the time, the DNA results came back only saying that the hairs belonged to a Caucasian male, which did little to whittle down the suspect pool. With little evidence and no clear suspects, the cases went quickly cold. Investigators went back to Gilgo Beach in the spring of 2011, hoping to comb the area for any kind of evidence that would crack the case. But instead of evidence, they found more human remains. 6 more victims were unearthed along the stretch of Ocean Parkway, one of which was a very young child. One of the victims was identified as Jessica Taylor. She was a sex worker who vanished from Manhattan in July 2003. In 2020, a second victim was identified as Valerie Mack, a sex worker who bounced from the Atlantic City, New Jersey area to Philadelphia. Her family last saw her in the summer of 2000. She was never reported missing, and it's not clear how she wound up dead in Long Island. A third victim, known as Jane Doe No. 7, was identified as Karen Vergata in 2023. Her family last heard from her on Valentine's Day, 1996. In April 2025, a fourth victim, who had been dubbed Peaches due to a tattoo she had, was identified as 26-year-old Tanya Denise Jackson, a medical assistant and military veteran. In addition, the baby doe found amongst the remains was identified as Jackson's 2-year-old daughter, Tatiana Marie Dykes, the fifth victim. Police are not discounting the possibility that the murders of Tanya and Tatiana may be unrelated to the other murders. The sixth and final victim, known as Asian Doe, the only one who remains unidentified at the time of this recording, is an Asian male found to be wearing women's clothing. It's thought that this victim may have been a cross-dresser or was transgender. However, the manner of their deaths and placements didn't match those of the Gilgo Four, and much to the dismay of the Gilbert family, Shannon Gilbert's body was still not among them. Investigators were stumped. Were all 11 bodies put there by the same person? Had the serial killer honed his skills over a period of time? Or were they dealing with more than one serial killer in Long Island, both targeting sex workers? They went out to the beach one final time in December 2011 and finally found the body of Shannon Gilbert. Far from the rest of the bodies, Shannon's remains were located around a half mile from where she disappeared into the marsh. But the new information only added to the mystery and deployed resources in too many different directions to make any traction. And unfortunately for Suffolk County law enforcement, the mid-2000s were plagued by a slew of changes in leadership and a public scandal that led to much of the focus being taken away from the Long Island serial killer investigation. By 2017, there was a potential suspect, a man named John Bittroff, who was a Suffolk County native who had murdered 2 sex workers. The lead prosecutor at the time believed that due to Bittroff's living near Gilgo Beach, coupled with his history of killing sex workers, and the fact that one of his victims had been good friends with Melissa Bartholomew, this all made him an excellent person of interest. However, while he was convicted of murdering 2 women in 2017, he had no DNA linkage to any of the Gilgo Four, and the nature of their deaths didn't fit the way Bittroff had killed his other victims. He was quickly eliminated as a suspect, and there were no more breaks in the case for another 6 years, leaving the victims' families without answers. Chapter 6. The case takes off. In 2022, things started moving. Suffolk County hired leadership who reinvigorated the resources surrounding the Long Island serial killer case, or the Lisk case as it came to be known. A new task force was created where the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, the New York State Police, the Suffolk County Sheriff's Department, and the FBI worked together to specifically review the Gilgo Four case. And Suffolk County law enforcement was able to start connecting pieces that had been hard to fit together previously. For one, based on the phone data collected from the contact with Amanda Bartholomew, investigators surmised that the killer had to live fairly close to Gilgo Beach, and he also had to be someone who commuted from Long Island to New York City, or vice versa, in order for the phone calls he'd placed to Amanda to have pinged in Manhattan. There was also an interview in the files with Dave Schaller, Amber's roommate. He told police back in 2010 that he believed the hulking man whom they'd scammed was the same person who had called Amber and coerced her into taking a ride into the Chevy Avalanche. By 2022, the task force was able to narrow a search to Avalanche owners residing near Gilgo Beach to a small handful of people. In addition, forensic technology specialists re-looked at the cell phone data from all the victims' phones for the conversations they had with their alleged killer around the time of their disappearances. All of the data led back to several burner phones that investigators were able to trace back to one person, a Manhattan architect named Rex Heuermann, who not only fit the physical description that Dave Schaller had given, but he lived in Massapequa Park, only 15 minutes from Gilgo Beach, and he commuted back and forth to the city. In addition, they found that Heuermann was one of the handful of people in the Gilgo Beach area who owned a green Chevy Avalanche. For the first time in 13 years, investigators had a real suspect in mind. Chapter 7. Following the suspect. While things looked good for police, the evidence surrounding Heuermann was still only circumstantial. They needed hard evidence, something that could provide them with DNA to test against the hairs that had been found on 3 of the bodies all those years ago. So for 6 weeks, detectives followed Heuermann everywhere. They sat on the quiet streets outside of his home. They followed him back and forth to work, and eventually their patience paid off, as one day Heuermann was seen walking on the sidewalk outside of his office eating a slice of pizza from a box. He threw the box away, and once he'd gone back inside, one of the surveillance detectives pulled the pizza box and sent it to the lab to see if there was a potential DNA match. Inside the box was a discarded half-eaten pizza crust. Using mitochondrial DNA forensics, the lab was able to determine that the hairs found on all 3 victims were a match to the DNA on the pizza crust. Only days after getting the DNA reports back, in July 2023, police arrested Rex Heuermann on the street outside of his Manhattan office. By all accounts, he went quietly and without a struggle. But would the DNA evidence be enough to have him charged? After all, it was plausible that he'd shared the pizza with someone else. They needed to know if it was his DNA on that pizza crust. Chapter 8. Charges and Trials. Suffolk law enforcement brought their case before a grand jury, seeking charges for the first and second degree murders of Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman, Amber Costello, and Maureen Brainerd Barnes. In their presentation, the district attorney cited the taunting calls Amanda Bartholomew had received after her sister's disappearance. They had been traced to 3 places within walking distance of Rex Heuermann's office. Likewise, evidence also suggested that Heuermann used his burner phones to search information and images of victims and their family members, including names, addresses, and social media. He was also doing counter-surveillance searches on the Long Island serial killer, perhaps trying to see if investigators were on his tail. Searches such as, "Why hasn't the Long Island serial killer been caught?" was one of the most frequent searches on the burner phones. There was also evidence connecting him to the 2 other murdered sex workers from 1996 and 2003, as well as a planning document found in Heuermann's home outlining his strategies for future murders. The grand jury found the case worthy of a trial, and Heuermann was officially charged with 6 counts of murder and remanded without bail on June 6, 2024. Rex Heuermann pled not guilty to all charges, and his defense attorney said they were looking forward to fighting this in a court of law. As of now, a trial date hasn't been set, as more evidence has been discovered after getting warrants for Heuermann's personal cameras, computers, and hard drives. Forensic specialists have to sift through all of his digital content as well as provide discovery to the defense before trial can even commence. For now, Rex Heuermann is being held without bail while he waits trial, which could be anywhere from 2 to 3 years from now depending on what new evidence is uncovered. So who exactly is this potential serial killer? Chapter 9. The Mind of a Killer. Throughout this highly publicized case, many have wondered how someone like Rex Heuermann could have gotten away with murder for such a long time. After all, he was married for 25 years and had 2 children who resided with him and his wife in their Massapequa Park home. Had no one in the Heuermann family noticed what he was up to? According to FBI criminal profilers, it's not uncommon for serial killers to live a double life. And it seems this was true in Heuermann's case, as investigators found that the disappearances of the Gilgo 4 aligned with times in which Heuermann's wife and children were out of town. So far, no evidence has been found to suggest his family knew about his connection to the murders, or were participants in any of the disappearances. and soon after he was arrested, Heuermann's wife filed for divorce. So the obvious question that comes to mind is, why did Rex Heuermann do all this? What was his motive? Unfortunately, when the show 2020 interviewed a few of Heuermann's former classmates and neighbors, none of them seemed surprised at his arrest. Described as an awkward young man who was often on the outside of the action, looking in, Heuermann was picked on mercilessly as a young child for his large size, but he also simultaneously scared his classmates due to how imposing he was and how mad he got when pushed to his limit. He was described as having a mean streak, though according to several former classmates, this didn't stop the physical and verbal abuse most students directed at him. Heuermann also had a rough childhood, starting with a complicated and verbally abusive relationship with his father, who died when Heuermann was 12. As a teenager, Rex Heuermann shoplifted, though he was never caught. And after high school, he worked as a beach cleaner for Gilgo Beach, only a short stretch away from Gilgo. Though he eventually graduated from New York's Institute of Technology and opened a very successful architectural firm on New York's Fifth Avenue, Heuermann's neighbors in Massapequa Park only knew him as a reclusive and vaguely sinister presence. Despite being an architect, news footage of Heuermann's home following his arrest reveals a rather shabby and unkept property, much in need of repair. Heuermann was known to stare at his female neighbor if she was sunbathing in the yard, and other neighbors commented that they never saw him coming or going from the house. There was always something secretive and off-putting about him. And while no official psychological assessment has been publicly reported, there are some things we can glean from his past, the available evidence found in his internet searches, and if he is indeed guilty of the murders of the Gilgo Four, the methods in which he entrapped and killed his victims. FBI profilers and forensic psychologists view much of Heuermann's behavior as sexual sadism, which is classified as a disorder where an individual finds sexual satisfaction in inflicting physical or psychological torment on a non-consenting victim. While only 1% of the general population has been found to have a sexual sadism disorder, it tends to appear in over 75% of serial killers. One theory suggests that, like many other serial killers who preyed on sex workers, Heuermann may have targeted them because they are a portion of the population most people wouldn't notice had gone missing. Likewise, if Heuermann had a skewed moral complex, killing them might be seen as a way to rid the population of their immoral work. We can see this in interviews with serial killer Robert Hansen, who lured sex workers to his home and then murdered them out in the Alaskan wilderness because he believed they were evil. Hansen's methods seem very similar to what happened to the Gilgo Four, so perhaps Heuermann had similar feelings about his victims. FBI profilers have also suggested that there were complex feelings of power and authority the killer felt while holding the lives of these vulnerable women in his hands as he inflicted psychological torture. Like the calls placed to Amanda Bartholomew, in which he terrorized her and her family, having the power to scare and cite deep levels of psychological trauma can create feelings of superiority and power. If Rex Heuermann is found guilty of these murders, then it's possible that any of these theories can explain how these 4 vulnerable women lost their lives at his hands. Chapter 10. Waiting for a conclusion. As of this recording, there's no set trial date for Rex Heuermann, and so there's no conclusion yet on the horizon for the victims' families, or the public who've closely followed this story. As for now, we'll all have to keep a watchful eye for developments in the Gilgo Beach case. But there have been several documentaries and interviews conducted on the Gilgo Four, if our listeners are interested in learning more. We recommend that you check out the 48 Hours documentary, The Long Island Serial Killer, 2020's documentary, Long Island Serial Killer, and the Eyewitness to Gilgo Beach podcast for exclusive interviews with investigators and the victims' families for a deeper dive into this case. Audience invitation. Is there a case or an unexplained communication you'd like us to cover? Please take the time to rate and review the show, and in your comments, tell us what case you'd like us to tackle. You can also follow us and reach us on social media. We're on x.com at KillerCPod, and on Facebook at facebook.com/KillerCommunicationsPodcast. And be sure to check out our website, KillerCommunicationspodcast.com. Killer Communications listeners, if you want to support this show and get access to things like ad-free listening, early release episodes, and any bonus content, consider supporting us with an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcast. For $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year, your AbJack Insider subscription will not only unlock all these great benefits for this show, but for every podcast on the AbJack network of indie podcasts. Get your AbJack Insider subscription started with a free trial. Simply head over to Apple Podcast and search for AbJack Entertainment, and you'll find the option to set up and unlock your subscription and start enjoying all the benefits of being a subscriber. We'll also include a link in the show notes. Your support is greatly appreciated. Just a heads up, new episodes of Killer Communications air every other Saturday. Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us on the next episode of Killer Communications.
Killer Communications is narrated and produced by Mike Morford for AbJack Entertainment. It's researched and written by Abigail Belcastro. Be sure to visit the show's website, killercommunicationspodcast.com, for past episodes, social media links, show news, and more.